While I was going through my various manuals on a day that was kind of slow in the shop, I came across my various books and notes on different things, from rebuilding Continental engines to Stromberg carburetors, all kinds of good stuff that I've collected over the months and years while working on my plane, carburetor stuff, magnetos, and finally, in the very back, I came across this article here. This is from, let me see, this is from, I believe, Vintage Airplane. I'm assuming that's a magazine, as you can see here. And this particular article, I don't remember how I acquired it. I don't know if I found this on the internet or if it was sent to me via email. I don't remember. But it's a very, very well written article about tapered shaft hub removal and installation. And the article is written by Bob, I believe it's pronounced Gehring, and Steve Krog. Let's see if I can get that on camera here. Those are the guys who had wrote the article originally. And it's a, it looks like it's a 3-page, yes, it looks like it's a 3-page article. Actually 4. Very well written. Very, very good information in here. But what I found the most intriguing was they had fabricated a tool, a hub removal tool, out of a socket, which is pictured here in the original article. So I decided that was such a great idea that I decided that I would try to fabricate my own. And this video is basically going to cover how I had made mine and a couple of the changes that I had made to it while fabricating it. So I thought I'd just make a quick video here to demonstrate what I had found out and what I had done, in case other people want to do so. And I highly recommend it. It's a great little tool, and it's perfect for getting the shaft on the hub on a tapered shaft Continental engine torqued to the proper torque. So the basics for the tool is it's a socket, and the original article used a short, regular, standard length socket. And if you can imagine this being a standard length socket, I wish I would have grabbed one actually. But anyway, if this was a standard length socket and you put a 5/8 hole through it, you don't have a lot of meat between the end of the socket and the 5/8 hole. That's why, if you read the article, they ended up welding a washer on the end of it to reinforce it and make it stronger. The other thing that I noticed, and I'll have pictures of this, I have Craftsman sockets, or I used to, and when you look down into the Craftsman socket, this cutout for the nut goes all the way down pretty much to the bottom of the socket. And if you look at, even on this snap-on socket, you look at the wall thickness from the nut cutout to the edge of the socket, it's very thin on these high points of the nut. And on the Craftsman socket, as I said, that profile goes all the way down the length of the socket, which in my mind makes the socket very, very weak. But I noticed on my nice my snap-on sockets, as this one, this is a snap-on socket, that profile, that nut profile, only goes down to about here. From that point down, it's a nice round socket. So what I decided to do was sacrifice one of my snap-on deep well sockets, and I cut this nut profile off. So I ended up cutting the socket off down around this area here, which left me a nice, long, heavy-walled, round socket. Okay, this is a 7/8 socket. I don't know if that's going to come out very well. It's a 7/8 half-inch drive deep well snap-on socket. So what I ended up with then was something like this. This again is a 7/8 snap-on socket. And this is the finished part, which I'll go into more here momentarily. But I wanted to show you, with that nut profile cut off, this is what I'm left with. Just a really heavy wall, round, internal bore socket. This wall thickness, if just looking at it, having to guess, I would say is probably about 3/16 of an inch thick. The other nice thing about using a long socket is, of course, I'll show this on when I'm going to switch cameras, or switch the camera over to the engine, which will explain it better. But the way that this socket fits, the reason I went with the 7/8 inch size was because this socket will fit down into the crankshaft itself, which means this hole can be backed up further down the socket, which gives you a nice meaty, what I call web thickness right here. And again, I'll go into that a little bit more here in a moment. So this is the finished product. I went from just a standard snap-on socket, and I cut off the nut profile area, leaving me this. Now originally I had cut the socket off up here a little bit more, but I found out through trial and error when I went to install this on the hub and started to torque it, as the hub nut screwed itself over the crankshaft, the socket started to bottom out on the crankshaft itself, and the whole mechanism started to bind. So I had to start shaving this back further and further until I got the hub completely torqued, and this was still loose and non-binding in the hub. And again, I'll go over that when I move over to the engine itself. So then there was the matter of locating this 5/8 inch hole. This is the same diameter hole as the holes on the end of the prop hub nut. And again, it was a matter of figuring out, in relation to this edge, how far back to set the hole so that you can tighten the socket, tighten the hub, and nothing binds. And again, through a little bit of trial and error, I found out that the distance from this edge to the center line of the 5/8 hole happens to be 5/8 of an inch. So once you get your socket cut to length, if you come back 5/8 of an inch, mark your hole location and drill the hole, you should be able to get your hub nut completely torqued correctly and nothing will be binding. So that's about it for the tool itself, the socket modifications. And I'll go into a simple, easy way, a couple of simple ways to locate a hole on a rounded socket, because you have to get it centered through the socket in this orientation. You don't want the hole offset one way or the other, and you don't want the hole clocked weird, because that's just going to make the socket weak on one side. So the hole needs to be through the center of the socket, and it needs to be straight, and I'll cover a couple of ways to do that. Next up is the shaft itself. This is nothing more than, this used to be a long 1/2 inch or a 5/8 inch stainless steel bolt, and it had a head on it, and it had the shank, which is what you see here, and then on the end of the shank was the threads. And I believe this entire thing was probably about 5 or 6 inches long. So I just cut the head off, cut the threads off, and this is what I ended up with. And I don't remember the exact length off the top of my head, but it's long enough that it fits the hub nut nicely. And again, I'll get to that in a moment. And that is it for the tool itself. And again, it's a 1/2 inch drive. I've seen a couple of different printed numbers as far as prop hub torque. The article that I had mentioned, where I had originally found this tool, they recommend, I think it was 200 to 250 or 200 to 225 foot-pounds. And I believe in the Tony Bengelis books, I believe he mentions going up to 300 something foot-pounds. So I am not going to go into proper torque numbers. I just wanted to show you the fabrication of the tool, and keep in mind that if you choose to do the higher torque numbers, it's got to be beefy enough to handle those higher torque numbers. So I think this particular tool here will handle any of that torque just fine. I think it's beefy enough and strong enough to handle pretty much anything. Alright, so I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to move on to some other aspects as far as fabricating the tool, and then I'll move on to the actual how it fits in relation to the tapered shaft hub itself. This is the tool that I use to locate the 5/8 inch hole that needs to be drilled through the socket. I believe this part was purchased through McMaster Carr, and it's basically just a V-block with a hole in it with a bubble level and a stop, an adjustable stop, and it also comes with the center punch that slides down through this hole. So basically how this works is you have your round stock, in this case it's going to be our socket. You measure down from the end your 5/8 inch mark, 5/8 inch down from the end of the socket, put a line. You take the V-block, and looking down, sighting down through the hole, you find your line. If you want, you could use the stop, the adjustable stop. It's not necessary, but if you want to use that, you can. After you have your line sighted down through the hole here, you insert your center punch and smack it with a hammer, and you'll have a nice little dimple right where your line was for the hole. Next step then is simply just a matter of taking the socket over to your drill press, clamping it in the vise. Once it's clamped, you again come back with your block and your center punch. Using the center punch as a guide, you relocate that dimple. Once you have your dimple located, you rotate this whole assembly until you get the bubble in the center. Once you have that centered, you can clamp the socket down nice and tightly, remove the tool, and now you'll have your dimple location on the line, and the socket with that hole location will be straight according to the bubble level. And then you just take that whole assembly, fit it underneath your drill press, drill your hole, and it will be in the right location, and it will be straight through the socket. And again, this tool, I believe I had purchased it from McMaster Carr. Very inexpensive, very simple, and easy to use, and it works great. Alright, so that's how I did mine. There's plenty of ways you can locate a hole to drill down through round stock, but this is just a tool that I went with, and it worked just fine. Alright, here we are, obviously at the engine. This is the taper shaft hub and nut assembly, of course, already mounted to the engine with the propeller mounted. What I want to point out is this is the crankshaft itself, and this is the screw-on plug that seals off the end of the crankshaft. What I had elected to do with my hub tool is I used a 7/8 inch socket, and the reason for that is the 7/8 inch socket will fit inside of the crankshaft here and rest up against this screw-in plug. What that does then, I don't know how well this was going to come out in the video, but the distance from this plug to the edge of the hole in the hub nuts is quite a bit. There's a good amount of length here, if you will, from the nut from the screw-in plug to the edge of the hole in the nut, the hub nut. What that gives you then on your tool is a nice beefy web thickness here. This socket will fit inside of the crankshaft up against that plug. And you can see going down through the hole here in the hub nut and down through the socket, you can do so with a nice beefy web thickness. Now I believe in the original article they went with a bigger socket that just fit inside of the hub nut, and that socket then would bottom out against the end of the crankshaft here. And again, if you could see the distance from the end of the crankshaft to the edge of the hub nut hole, it's very, very minimal. So the web thickness here would be very, very thin. And I believe that's why they went with the welded on washer for reinforcement, because the socket wall thickness itself was very thin and the web thickness here was very thin. And as soon as you put any kind of a twisting moment on that, it would crack and split apart. Using a deep well socket with a very heavy wall thickness and a small enough diameter that you can run it all the way down into the crankshaft, you get a very, very strong, beefy tool without any kind of reinforcements being needed. The other thing, as I said, was this socket originally was quite a bit longer, and this web thickness was quite a bit more beefier. But I found out that when I had the tool installed, if you can imagine this being installed, as the hub nut was being screwed down onto the crankshaft, the end of the socket started to bind on this nut. As this screwed itself into the crankshaft, the tool itself started to bind. So I had to keep shaving length off of this. I had to keep shaving this further and further back, so that ultimately, let me grab the proper shaft here. Ultimately, when the tool is in place and the prop hub nut is tight, nothing is binding. As you can see here, this is still very free and very loose, and there's no binding at all. So this length here, this dimension from the hole to the edge of the socket is just about right. And again, that dimension from the end of the socket to the center line of the hole is 5/8 of an inch. And you can get away with that with with a longer deep well socket, and you still have plenty of socket left, if you will, for your torque wrench. The end of the socket here is not buried into the prop hub. And that is the basics behind that. There's the tool installed, and you can see that this shaft is plenty long enough for the hub. I don't see a reason to have this any longer. Of course, you could just run the bolt itself in here without cutting the head and the threads off, but I just liked this setup a little bit better, so I cut the head and the threads. But that's it. That's the tool. And now you can torque your prop hub exactly as you need it. You can torque it directly to the proper torque every time, all the time, without guessing. And of course, it makes it a lot easier for hub removal. If you end up having to remove a prop or a hub from a tapered shaft and you have no idea what the torque is, if it's got some outrageous amount of torque on it, this tool will actually make removing even those quite a bit easier. So again, I highly recommend Fabricating one. They're quite simple. Originally I had planned on using a milling machine with digital readouts and other high precision tooling to make my hub tool, but I decided I could probably serve the tapered shaft hub community, if you will, better by fabricating it using nothing but hand tools and explaining how I did it that way. I thought that would be a little bit more informative for people who wanted to fabricate one rather than trying to track down a milling machine and figure out how to using one. So with some simple hand tools, a socket, and a bolt, you can have your own. Alright, so that will do it for the prop hub, and I will hopefully see you guys again soon. Take care. Hey everybody, just wanted to say real quick again, thanks for checking out my YouTube videos, and just a couple of real quick tidbits before you leave. If you'd be so kind as to check out my GoFundMe page, the link is down in the description of these videos. For those of you who find it in your heart to donate for this new cause of mine, I've got another project going on. And there's some really cool things I'd like to do with this aircraft, and again, that's all explained in my GoFundMe. But if you find moved enough to go do that and donate, I've got this horizontal stabilizer skin, and donors will get their name put on this skin, and ultimately when this gets filled and the aircraft gets finished, this is going to be hung up on the wall of honor in my hangar, just a little bit of recognition for those donors who helped make the project a reality. Another thing too is, I'm sure you've noticed that even this video that I'm making right now is of the same or worse quality than the video that you just watched, and that's because, believe it or not, this camera is the exact same camera that I filmed the original hint videos with. So I just wanted to point that out. I'm not really sure why, but I know the video quality lacks, but hopefully the information within is worth something. And the other thing that I want to mention real quick is, again, these are little snippets from my hint video DVDs, so a lot of these individual clips just kind of come to an abrupt end. That's just the way it is when I'm trying to rip these DVDs apart and re-edit them into small little segments, and they just kind of end weird at times. But that's it. That's all I wanted to say. And again, thanks, and I hope you'll come back, check out my channel, and see if there are any new videos and updates. All right, I'll talk to you then. See you.